Not long ago at all, hydrogen was being touted as the next big thing in energy. It was not only going to help heavy industry and heavy goods vehicles to decarbonise, but it was maybe even going to be used instead of natural gas to heat millions of homes. Now, some of us expressed scepticism even then, certainly about the UK trial of pumping it into a set number of homes via the old gas infrastructure. We seemed to fly in the face of practicalities as I understood them. Now it seems that the favourite government trick of setting high targets that are totally out of sight of the practical measures that you'd have to take to meet them, it's going the way that it usually goes. So, why is that? And if the bold new hydrogen future is not at hand, what is likely to actually be delivered? Well, let's have a look. Now, context is everything. At least that's what I keep telling people, for what it's worth. The key contextual element I think you have to hold on to in this discussion is the current level of hydrogen production in the world. It's basically tiny. Scenarios put forward by the global net zero energy mix of 2050 had as much as 20% being provided from hydrogen, so up from basically nothing today to around 800 million tonnes of the stuff within 30 years. To be on track for that, you would expect to see a cool 70 million tonnes produced per annum by 2030, which is just 6 years away. The European Union declared itself as game for all this when it recently published its hydrogen strategy, promising to hit a target of 20 million tonnes per annum by 2030, half of that to be domestically produced, half to be imported. What appealed to them all was the vision that in hydrogen you could have an energy source that could, in a single bound, decarbonise big chunks of the economy with next to no inconvenience to livelihoods, existing industries, or indeed to citizens. And lots of companies, seeing the potential of a whole new market, with lots of money flowing into it, were queuing up to be early movers, which is great, and is what you would expect. Except you still have to ask, just how much early moving do you require to get from A being almost nowhere, remember, to B? And the answer seems to be a lot more early moving than has actually been, moving. So yes, developers have been announcing projects, and the manufacturers of hydrogen equipment have been making big promises to scale up production while bringing down prices. Policymakers were promising big subsidies, which may not have been entirely coincidental to all those other announcements. But unsurprisingly, the first wave of projects came at a high cost. And because modern Western societies all now seem to be completely incapable of building anything whatsoever of any size according to a budget, the projected costs have all been revised upwards, sometimes even doubling. So, for example, the 30 megawatt Bad Lauchstadt project in Germany has added 50% cost to reach 210 million euros. Liebrich Associates told the Financial Times that something like $200 billion of subsidies may be handed out to generate hydrogen by 2030. Now, that sounds like a lot to me. Until you consider that those big fancy targets put forward by the policymakers would require more like $2 to $4 trillion. I tend to think that when you're changing or creating an entire industry, it's good to move as fast as possible, yes, but not try to move a lot faster than that. Now, in any case, it's not happening. Those 2030 targets now seem increasingly like a fantasy. It doesn't help, of course, that most of what little hydrogen currently does exist doesn't qualify, being so-called grey hydrogen. Grey hydrogen is that which is produced from natural gas, a process which, naturally enough, emits carbon dioxide, so rather defeating the object. Only so-called green hydrogen is seen as the way of the future. Green hydrogen is produced from renewable energy. Now, I would presume that hydrogen produced with nuclear energy would also count. Apparently that isn't called green hydrogen, it's called purple or red hydrogen or pink hydrogen, which is all very colourful. I'm not sure to what purpose. Currently, the only green hydrogen plants that exist are demonstration or pilot plants, so small, in other words, producing a total annual production of less than 0.1 megatons per annum. Here's a graph with data from the Hydrogen Council showing the yawning gap between the planned hydrogen projects, those that are planned, those that are announced, and then right at the bottom, those that are actually committed. Remember, the target is 70 million tonnes per annum by 2030. Well, right now, final investment decisions have been taken on just 3 million tonnes per annum. If you analyse the process optimistically, says the consultancy BNEF, you might push that to 16 million tonnes. Probably no other policy area has shown up quite so starkly the shortcomings of the single variable policy-making approach, by which I mean when politicians ask, well, when must emissions reach zero? They then get given an answer based on some working group's most optimistic calculations of how fast a perfect government, supported by a supremely tolerant electorate, could potentially do it, while still obeying the laws of physics. And then they say, right then, that's the target and we'll accept it. Because obviously anything less than that would be seen by some as deliberately roasting the planet to the detriment of young people especially. But of course, in the absence of the perfect government or the perfect risk-taking investors and the perfect long-suffering electorates, the targets put forward are basically from La La Land. Putting forward targets that can't be met in the real world. It's not radical, it's just distracting and calculated to make an absolute mess of anyone who behaves as though the figures are real. And probably by so doing, likely to make it slower to make progress than you would have done if you dealt with the world of the possible from the beginning. Now, I can't prove that one way or another, since we can't run A-B split testing on history, but ultimately it's cost that's putting the brakes on. Not just the ballooning costs of construction, but also the price of the green electricity needed to power the electrolyzers to produce the hydrogen. Often that is at $4.50 to $6.50 per kilogram, rather than the $3 that had been hoped to have been reached by now. Bear in mind, you already lose a lot of energy in the process of conversion. You lose energy when you convert from electricity into hydrogen, and you lose energy when you convert the hydrogen back into heat at the point of use. And it's not as though there's masses of renewable energy to spare. If using it to create hydrogen means you still have fossil fuels powering your electricity grid, probably made a suboptimal move there. All that means that green hydrogen comes out costing something like $216 per megawatt hour, and that's before you've shipped it anywhere. Right now, according to the Financial Times, natural gas costs around $8 per megawatt hour. 8. Now that rises to €30 in the EU, where there's been something of an energy crisis to work through. You have to have a very specific use case defined to make those figures look like an exciting investment opportunity, with or without relatively modest government subsidies. And part of the challenge is that even some of those use cases are being solved in other ways before you can even get to them. Take cement, for instance. One of the most essential materials used by societies the world over, up until now, unable to be produced without extremely high temperatures you could never reproduce using electricity. The cement industry produced 3 times more emissions worldwide than the air flight industry, for all that journalists and environmentalists obsess about the latter, and hardly mention the former. So cement production could easily be one of the high-value use cases for hydrogen. except that just in the last few weeks, a new innovation was announced that could make the manufacture of standard cement massively more energy efficient, bringing it easily within the scope of a process that could be powered with electricity. It's a solution that requires relatively little cost and investment and very little disruption to the majority of existing players in the market. In other words, it has a bunch of things going for it that the use of green hydrogen really at the moment does not. Now, that still leaves industrial processes producing iron and steel and a number of chemicals. Industrial energy accounts for a quarter of energy use globally, so that's no small deal. But even then, there may be other changes that make the use of hydrogen redundant in some of those. For instance, we have recently heard about the development of electrothermal batteries that use electricity to heat bricks and rocks to provide a manner of creating those industrial high temperatures. According to energy consultancy Systemic, the temperatures reached may ultimately go as high as 1,500 degrees Celsius. Should that promise be realised, those batteries would be a lot more energy efficient than burning hydrogen. None of this means that a significant hydrogen sector won't be developed. There are some use cases that will support early development. There are some locations, particularly those that are better suited to get lower cost renewable energy, that will be more attractive, which is probably why 5 of the 7 recently successful projects in Europe's Hydrogen Bank's recent auction, they were all sited in the sunny south of the continent, where solar energy is more plentiful and reliable. But expect to hear somewhat less about hydrogen as the next big thing in the future. And if you hear politicians setting huge targets for it in the wake of the rash of elections we're seeing in the world this year, I suggest you do what I will be doing, rolling my eyes and counting down the days before they reverse course on their declared targets, having realised their impossibility and or undesirability. Most recently, I've been rolling my eyes at the companies in South Korea producing a new hydrogen combustion engine that they hope will solve the driving range and refilling time objections to electric vehicles and hence conquer the world of transport. Well, good luck with that. Meanwhile, hydrogen car sales in Japan have fallen by 83% during the last 2 years. Again, the country's hydrogen strategy had set a target of 800,000 hydrogen passenger vehicles on the road by 2030. So far, just 8,000 have been sold. On the plus side, hey, there have been innovations to make the production of cement much more energy efficient, and potentially steel as well, and that is a huge deal. People are making progress on other forms of high industrial heating. So there's that. All of those would have been front page news if the media weren't more interested in lower impact questions about whether you're going to eat meat or not and how you get to your holiday destinations. At least you know you can still come to this channel for the news that really matters. Well, some of it anyway.